הצגה של אבי ג'וזף כהן. אם אתם לא שמעתם קודם את השם, היא גורו של הרבה משקיעים בארצות הברית. היא עובדת בחברת גולדמן זאקס בארצות הברית, והיא באמת מומחית בינלאומית בענייני פיננסים בינלאומיים. היא שותפה בכירה, לא מומחית, בחברה הזו, והיא תיתן לנו הצגה או פרזנטציה בעברית צחה על כל הנושא הפיננסי סיני.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Excellent. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you, and I'm glad that the technical problems have been resolved. I don't know if I have been introduced or if the topic has been introduced. So let me spend just a moment. I know that there has already been a great deal of discussion about trade between China and other nations, especially Israel. And I've been asked to step back and to provide a broader perspective by talking about the role of China in the global economy. So as it affects not just Israel, but truly the rest of the planet. I did provide a handout for use during this presentation. I don't know if you have it. Are people holding it, or is it up on the screen?
No, it isn't.
Just a minute.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'll do is call out page numbers so that you can follow me. And let me begin, please, with page 2, which presents an array of countries throughout the world. And you'll see that there are GDP numbers for the last few years and forecasts. But let's take a look, please, in that very first column, which shows you the size of these economies. The U.S. economy, without a doubt, the world's single largest economy, at about $17 trillion a year. Next is the Eurozone. But the Eurozone is not a single economy. It's obviously a combination. The second single largest economy in the world is China, at about $9.5 trillion. And so despite the enormous growth of China in recent years, the U.S. is still larger and larger by a significant degree. In the last column over on the right, you can see the projected growth rates in GDP for the various nations. And once again, let's take a look at the U.S. at about 2%, China somewhere between 6 and 7%. Now we're talking about the world's second largest economy that is growing quite rapidly. I know that many people are wringing their hands. They're very upset that China is no longer growing at 12%. Well, 10 to 12%, which had been achieved for many, many years, is no longer plausible and no longer expected for several reasons. Number one, an economy that is very large, it's not likely to grow as quickly as it had been previously because the base is much larger. And secondly, something that hopefully we all know is that China is in the process of a very important transition. During its years of very rapid growth, China was growing on the basis of enormous increases in exports, particularly of low-cost manufactured goods. And there was also significant growth coming from dramatic investment in public infrastructure. Once that infrastructure is built there's no need to spend quite as much or to have that continue to grow as it was. But the most important issue that we should be talking about is not the growth numbers for 2015 or 2016, but let's look at page 3, in which we are examining estimates for long-term potential growth of various economies. You'll see that my Goldman Sachs colleagues are expecting that over the next 5 years and longer, potential growth in the U.S. is just about 2%, specifically 1.8. If we had more time, I could speak to you about why technically there are enormous problems in coming up with this estimate, and most likely this estimate is too low. And the reasons center around the fact that in the U.S. economy, we're not counting things properly. For example, the youngest, fastest growing companies and industries are not included in the sampling techniques, the statistical sampling done by the government. And so the fast growing sectors in technology, in biotechnology, and in many other categories are not included yet in GDP, and it may very well be that our potential growth is faster. That may be the case, by the way, for other nations as well. If you look down on this table, you'll see that the projected potential growth for China is about 6%. And let's not get too concerned about the specific numbers. They could vary, obviously, but an economy that is already as large as China, that we think can generate growth of 6%, is actually doing quite well. Because if you contrast this to other economies not nearly as large as China, they're doing well that have growth of 1 or 2%. One of the things I was asked to discuss is the impact of China on the global economy. To discuss that, let's look at page 4, which is a bar chart in which we're looking at, let's call it momentum. And not momentum in a stock market way, but momentum in a pure physical sense. If you remember your basic physics, momentum is mass or size times velocity or speed. That is, how big is something and how fast is it growing? Because that multiplication gives us the aggregate size of the impact. And on page 4, we're looking at that. Last year, 2015, the fastest growing economy was India. That's the country that you see first on the left in dark green. But India is not yet quite as large as China or the United States. And China is the second economy listed here in gray. And you can see that China grew about 6.5% or 7% in 2015, but it is a larger economy. And so the volume of the economy on this chart, you can see for China is quite significant. In 2015, and in fact, throughout the financial crisis and throughout the severe global recession, Chinese growth provided a very important counterpoint. It provided balance. And so when the US was in recession, and when Europe was in recession, not once but twice since the global financial crisis, it was China that was growing. And Chinese policymakers provided economic stimulus to make sure that that growth continued, and it was to the benefit of the global economy. We have to keep in mind that China was the odd country, continuing to grow while many other nations were having a problem. I'm going to skip page 5 just in the interest of time. It takes a look at how important various categories of spending are to consumers in various nations. In India and China, so much of the consumer budget goes to things like food and energy, but in developed economies, much less. And so in developed economies where households are already middle class and higher, what we basically see is spending on these basic necessities is a smaller percentage of total, and in these economies, households can spend money on other issues and grow in a different way. But let's go back to the basic question of how fast an economy can grow over a long period of time, and I would ask that we turn to page 6. If, as an economist, I'm asked to provide the single most important variable that will determine long-term economic growth and the creation of economic wealth, not stock market wealth, not portfolio wealth, but economic wealth, wealth for households, wealth for the overall economy, productivity is the prime factor, and productivity is driven by investment in several categories, but we can put those categories into 2 groups. The first group is capital. How are we investing in equipment? How are we investing in research? How are we investing in the long-term needs like public infrastructure? And the second category includes investment in people, in education, in giving labor skills, and by the way, making them feel safe and secure so that they can work at their maximum potential. On page 6, we're looking at investment in one of those important categories, and that is research and development. Now, I want to make something very clear. For the last century, the United States has been number 1 in this category. No nation has invested more in R&D than the United States. But the US is the world's largest economy, and what we've done on page 6 is to scale it by the size of an economy. You would expect a large economy like the US to spend a lot on CapEx and R&D. What you can see here is that R&D as a percentage of GDP, the number 1 country in the world is Israel, at about 4 to 4.5%. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States was 4 to 4.5%, but also, as you can see in that second arrow on this chart at the bottom, the United States is now at about 2.5%. And China is now at about 2. Now, I don't know if you can see this slide as easily on the screen, but you'll see there are 2 bars for every country. One represents 2013, and one represents 2001. China is distinguished by having the biggest increase in this. So R&D as a percentage of GDP for China is now about 2%, much less than the US, much less than Israel, but China has doubled its commitment to R&D over this period of time. On page 7, we can see some commitment as it relates to spending on people, and that is spending on researchers in science and technology. If you wouldn't mind grabbing that for me. What we basically see is that the number of researchers in the world is highest in the United States. But again, we're scaling it by size of population, by size of workforce. And when we do it that way, again, Israel is now ranked number 1 in this category. The United States is in the middle of the pack, and China is toward the bottom. This is something that can take many, many years for China to raise its standards, because it's not just a question of spending, it's a question of education and bringing on the next generation of scientists, which can take many years. On page 8, we can look at this in a somewhat different way. Now, these data are not from me, but rather from the World Economic Forum. So if you have some argument with the specifics, don't argue with me. But what we're looking at here is the linkage between scientific research and innovation in the overall economy. Scientific research is on that x-axis, and innovation is on the bottom axis. And what I'd ask you to look at is that in that upper quadrant, that upper northeast quadrant, the countries that are leaders, both in research and in innovation, are nations like the US, Switzerland, number of others you'd expect, and Israel is up there as well. By the way, Switzerland is there because of its pharmaceutical industry and no other reason. The countries that are more diverse, UK, Japan, and Germany, are up there as well. But what about the bottom end, the southwest quadrant? And here we see nations with an entirely different growth model. Upper northeast quadrant, the growth model is invest and educate. In the lower quadrant, it's keep costs really low. So we have nations like India, Brazil, and China. The interesting thing about China is that it used to be off the scale at the bad end because its performance in research and innovation was so poor, it didn't even register. And so over the last 10 years in particular, we see China moving up this spectrum, which is really quite impressive. On page 9, there are a number of factors listed that contribute to innovation. Now, I pulled this from a listing of more than 50 separate factors because there were a few that I thought were fascinating. I'm not going to discuss all of them, but if you take a look at R&D, ranked number 1 in the world, according to this survey, is Israel. If we look at infrastructure, which is so critical to keeping an economy running smoothly, investment in roads, investment in utilities, China is ranked number 3. If we think about who has the capital markets to be able to get the money together to get things done, the United States is ranked number 1. Next point, innovation. Linkages within an economy, Israel, number 1. And finally, something that you might find very amusing, given the difficulties we've had this morning, is who is the most sophisticated in terms of using internet and video, and you can see that Israel and the United States are ranked number 1. It didn't work quite so well for us today, but we have it working now. And so one of the things that economists like me look at all the time basically is the long-term investment that is being made in terms of R&D, in terms of capital expenditure, but very importantly, in an information economy, the investments that are being made in people per se. And the countries that we're watching very carefully, of course, are the US, Israel, and China, which says something about the importance of the conference that you're all attending today. Now, again, let me get back to the topic of the role of China in the global economy, and let me skip to page 11, which shows foreign trade for Israel, because I want to give you a sense of the way things have been shifting. I'll come to China in just a moment. The way to read this complicated table is which nations is Israel sending its exports to, and in the second set of columns, where are the imports coming from? As you can see, 30.7% of Israeli exports are sent to North America, 25% to Europe, but take a look at Asia at 28%. 28% of Israeli exports go to Asia. Of this, 13 to 14% to the combination of China and Hong Kong. A few years ago, this number was close to 0. There has been enormous growth in this category. But now also let's take a look at page 12, which is the same table, but for China. Where does China send its exports? About 20.8% come to North America, 15.6% go to Europe. But now let's take a look at Chinese trade, much of which is within Asia per se, but where has one of the biggest increases been? to the Middle East, and of course, significant improvement in trade with Israel. Now, there are many other topics I can discuss. A lot of discussion in recent days about what's happening to Chinese capital flows in and out of the country. Page 13, we're looking at foreign exchange reserves, which have started to move lower. I'm not going to discuss this, but in the Q&A, if you'd like me to, I certainly will. On page 14, we can see that decline in foreign exchange reserves for China has been seen in many other countries as well over the last handful of years. And with regard to foreign exchange, page 15, I'm showing you the value of the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, relative to the dollar. Because on page 15, we're looking at foreign exchange relative to the dollar for all of the major trading partners of the United States. And what you can see is the following. Almost all of these currencies have gone down substantially relative to the dollar, particularly over the last 2 years. There's one currency that hasn't changed very much, and that's the Chinese renminbi. So for all of the discussion about currency manipulation and the Chinese yuan going down in value, in fact, the movement there has been dramatically less than it has been for most other currencies. Now, I'd like to conclude the formal part of my presentation by introducing the following topic. So far, I've been talking about where long-term economic growth can come from. From China, an enormous increase that we've seen in investment, public infrastructure, capital expenditures, and now we're seeing increases as well in education, R&D, and of course, that foreign trade picture for China has been changing as well. Much of the trade is no longer for China as the low-cost producer exporting other places, but there's also been an increase in bilateral trade in which China is not just exporting, but also importing from other nations. When we think about what can go wrong, we often turn our attention in every country to policy. We turn our attention in recent years to the health of the financial system and a whole host of other factors. I'm happy to discuss that in Q&A. But as part of my presentation, I'd like to end with my observation that one of the biggest risks, not just for China, but also for India and some other emerging economies, is now the environment. And on page 16, we'll begin with a quick review of the amount of energy that's being used by various nations, the energy efficiency. And the way this is calculated is how much energy is used to generate a unit of GDP. The highest, meaning the worst performance, is that of Russia. Russia uses an awful lot of energy to generate GDP. But next is China, and then South Korea. And some of this may be representative of what is produced in those economies, and that is if they're heavily dependent on manufacturing, they're going to use more energy. At the other end of this slide, you can see the nations that are more efficient, the ones that use less energy to generate GDP. And at the lowest end, i.e. the best place to be, is Israel. Other developed economies, France, Japan, Germany, use their energy wisely. By the way, you might notice that the United States uses more energy than some of these other sophisticated developed economies. Let me assure you, it's not because our industrial processes are inefficient or our electric generation is inefficient. It's very efficient. The United States uses more energy for GDP because we drive very large cars, as I'm sure many of you know, and we drive very large cars longer distances because we tend to live further from our work. than is the case in almost any other developed country. So something that we benefit from right now are low energy prices, but it will come back at some point to be a problem for us. Page 17 shows the emission of greenhouse gases. And here you can see that China is the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide. It's also the world's largest emitter of sulfur dioxide and a number of other greenhouse gases. And it emits far more than the United States, even though the United States is a much larger GDP. Now, one of the reasons is that so much energy is used in China to generate that GDP, but it's also the mix of energy. China is a huge user of coal, the dirtiest possible source of energy. And one of the things that China is trying to do is to shift away from coal. But coal is cheap, and a lot of the existing facilities for electricity generation are based on coal. Interestingly, the newer facilities for electricity in China are moving away from coal. And so we can see that when we worry about the environment, we worry about who uses energy efficiently, who's emitting greenhouse gases, but we also worry about something that is often not discussed, and that is what scientists would refer to as the particulate emission. That is the particles. In the United States, we call that the crud, the junk in the air. And on page 18, we have a listing throughout the world of various cities. Who has the worst air quality? Almost all of the dirtiest cities on this basis are either in India or in China. And when we take a look at who has the cleanest air, if that's what you're interested in, please, Sydney, Australia is the place for you. The other cities that are clean, and this may surprise you, Paris, London, and New York. Much of this is related to the fact that clean air regulations were put in place in the United States some 30 years ago. We used to have a big problem with particulate emissions, particularly in places like New York and Los Angeles. We don't anymore. Why isn't Los Angeles on this list the way New York is for being really clean? Because Los Angeles still has some particulate emissions. 25% of their crud, the particulate emissions in California, come from China. They can get tagged, and it comes from the use of coal in China. And then the final environmental issue, which could have an impact on long-term potential growth, and that is water. On page 19, we're showing how throughout the world the growth in the use of water has been concentrated, not surprisingly, in emerging economies, because they're getting bigger and they're using more water. In places like the United States and the major cities like New York, the use of water per capita has actually come down. We've learned to be more sensible in terms of conserving the water that we have. But on the final page, I'd like to show who has the most water and who has the least. Something that I love to show on the left-hand side of this chart is Canada. Canada is the most blessed nation on the planet. It has the most water, and we're showing the most water per capita. Canada has lots and lots of water. A lot of it is frozen, by the way, but this is surface water, and Canada has a small population. So they look great, absolutely great on this chart. Who doesn't look so good? If we take a look at the far right, we see very arid nations of the Middle East and North Africa. Not very much water at all. That doesn't surprise the people in the room. I can see the grins and smirks on your faces about this. But you can also see that the two fastest growing economies on the planet, China and India, are also water-starved. And this is an enormous problem, because on this chart, I'm showing you not just water per capita, I'm missing something. And what I'm missing is whether the water is usable. And in both China and India, a lot of the water is not clean. It's not clean enough for personal use, human use. You wouldn't want to drink it. You wouldn't want to take a bath in it. But some of the water is so dirty, you can't even grow crops in it. This is an enormous problem and could be a significant issue in terms of long-term economic growth. For China, there has been a solution. And the solution is actually in two parts. One part is to import water. Well, how do you import water? You don't bring it in bottles. You bring it in products that have a lot of water in them. You bring it in agricultural goods. You can import grain, but more importantly, you import something else that uses even more water, and that's protein. Things like chicken and pork use a lot of water to develop, but even more is beef. And what the Chinese have been doing has been to import what we refer to as virtual water. If you don't have enough clean water at home, bring it in through these other products. But there's another type of solution, and that solution is technology. And this is where Israel comes in. The Chinese have been importing water technologies. How do you produce more water? Israel knows better than any other country on the planet, and that is whether it's desalination or what you refer to as desalination, but Americans call desalinization, or how to use wastewater effectively. Now, my numbers may be wrong, but Israel is number one in terms of being able to convert wastewater into water that is then usable. And I think the number is, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 80%. Maybe it's even higher. Spain is the second highest, and Spain is 20%. For China to continue to grow in an unimpeded fashion, they will need to use some of these technologies as well. And one of the reasons we saw the growth in imports from Israel to China that I showed you on that foreign trade table earlier is a lot of it is in fact technologies related to water. Some of it is technologies related to solar energy. And it's one of the reasons that we're now seeing these stronger economic linkages. And I think this is a good place for me to stop. I hope we do have time for Q&A given our late start due to the technology issues. But let me assure you that if you do want the PDF of the presentation, we can make that available to you. And I'm happy now to answer any questions that you have and that we may have time for. So I turn it over back to you.
Abby. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
So I hope you heard the applaud.
I did, thank you.
You were great, absolutely great. You were absolutely right in stating the 80% figure for recycling. We already have the Minister of Transportation who just entered the hall. So only one question that I will allow myself to ask. You showed the quadrant where Israel is investing the second, the largest, number one in R&D as per the GDP. And China on the other side of this line. The question is, why should anyone invest, especially if he has the money to buy? He goes to a university in Haifa, in Tel Aviv. He proposes $150 million in supporting the activities of the university, and then he buys directly, indirectly, the product or the whatever this university has been able to develop. What's wrong with this?
Well, one of the things that we're all focused on is that when the creativity is used and the R&D is developed and the product is developed, that we find a way that it is helpful to the home country. And clearly, one of the government policies in Israel is to make sure that that can happen, because that's what allows people to earn a good living in Israel, to stay, and of course, we then have that very virtuous cycle. What we know is, of course, that there has been significant investment in Israel, not just by Israelis, but by companies and institutions in other nations. I'm going to give you a personal example. I am on the board of the new graduate-level technology university in New York City, which we call Cornell Tech. And Cornell Tech, in large part, is a joint effort between Cornell, which is an Ivy League university, and the Technion. And the idea is to bring the best of both worlds together in terms of technical education, but also to train scientists and technologists to know how to run businesses, to know how to have an impact on others. It's no longer enough to be a technologist. You have to know how to apply that in other industries, whether it is pharmaceutical, healthcare, media, and so on. And one of the things that we're all committed to is that this cooperation between a U.S. university and an Israeli university will benefit Israel, hopefully even more than it can benefit what's happening in New York.
Once again, many, many thanks. Hope to see you soon among us, and toda rabba.